Open world has become the new standard in the gaming industry, and it seems like more and more releases are adopting this gameplay style. But just take a look at some of the greatest games over the past few years and you'll begin to understand why. An open world setting allows for an incredible amount of creativity, seemingly much more than a linear style of game design. But this is where I want to raise the question, are linear games worse than open world games? There really isn't a clear answer for this at first, especially when you consider that even in open world games there can be a fairly linear storyline. For example, GTA 5 is completely open world in the sense that you can go anywhere on the map, but if you want to complete the story, it's still pretty much linear. In the same sense, just because a certain game is two-dimensional and is not considered open world doesn't mean it's a linear adventure. So in order to distinguish what type of games we're talking about in this video, let's make 4 separate categories: open world 3D, linear 3D, open world 2D, and linear 2D. Let's break down each category of game and some of my favorite titles from each and find out what truly is the best kind of design. First, let's talk about one of the most old school style designs for a game, linear 2D. The game which popularized this genre was obviously Super Mario Bros. For the NES. In this kind of game, you usually have one objective and oftentimes it's to reach the end of the level. Of course, throughout the years, this style has evolved to allow for slightly more freedom, including things like world maps and branching paths. Either way, these games were ultimately all about the gameplay within each level, and less about things like atmosphere and discovery. Things like your ability to do skilled platforming and getting past difficult objects was what made these games shine. However, platformers are not the only type of linear 2D game. Technically speaking, games like Undertale would fall under this category too, and we don't consider that game limiting at all. So what did Undertale do right to make such a good game with a seemingly limited format? Well, developer Toby Fox ensured that the narrative of the game was what made you feel like you were in control. Undertale is a game you get to play in 3 different ways. The first is playing the game just like any other RPG, killing any random encounter monster and boss you come across. The second way is the pacifist route, where you understand that monsters in this game are not actually enemies and you spare them. The third and final way is the genocide route, where you know exactly how the game works and you go out of your way to kill every monster in the game. These routes aren't just different endings though, instead they literally change how the monsters in the underground will interact with you throughout the run. In a neutral run, they'll treat you neutrally. If you play the genocide run, all the monsters will hide from you and you literally have to spend a while searching the areas just to kill them. And if you play the pacifist route, you will be able to see all of the different personalities and dialogue that the monsters have to offer. The thing is, this all takes place in a completely linear two-dimensional world. So while some believe that having a linear 2D style of game is a thing of old, games like Undertale prove that this is simply not the case. The next style I want to talk about are open world 2D games, and at first, this might sound a bit impossible, but if we look closer, extremely popular franchises like The Legend of Zelda have used this formula extensively across some of its best releases. These games typically have you take on a top-down perspective of the overworld, connected without the use of loading screens or level selection. This gives the player the feeling of traveling a vast world even though it's a two-dimensional game. A really popular variation of this style can be found in many of the Pokemon games, in which you almost never experience a loading screen unless you're entering a building or a cave. Even though these games start off quite linearly, they often let you go off and branch into different directions after you get through a few hours of gameplay. Of course, this doesn't change that much besides the order in which you do things, but it still gives quite the illusion of freedom. I think that this style is largely going out of fashion though, simply because the rise of 3D open world games, where you can spin the camera around and truly see all of the different places in the game, rather than a 2D open world game where you can only see what's directly around the player. Next, let's talk about one of the most interesting styles of game, linear 3D. When you hear this, it really sounds like it doesn't make sense. If a game is three-dimensional, doesn't that mean it's basically open world? No, but I think this is unfortunately a mentality a lot of younger gamers are going to grow up with. To be fair, most 3D games nowadays have a lot of open world elements, but in no way does that mean that they are truly open world. Let's take a look at the entire 3D Mario franchise, for example. Not one game out of all of these is considered truly open world, with the exception of Bowser's Fury. In reality, when Mario turned 3D, Nintendo turned the concept of worlds into courses and levels into missions or episodes. Mario 64's individual levels can be considered open world in a sense, but you still get kicked out of the stage when you collect collect the star. Not to mention that each world is completely separated from one another. This formula is one that would stay throughout all of the Mario games because it works. Even in Mario Odyssey, this is mostly the same, except you don't get kicked out of the level when you collect a moon. Perhaps going forward, Nintendo might want to switch 3D Mario into that open world formula, but they really don't have to. This more linear style of 3D gaming has been the king of the industry for many years at this point, being the foundation of franchises like Dark Souls and God of War. Some might argue that this style is going to go out of fashion in the near future, and while that certainly is possible, I don't think that it's likely. There will always be an audience for linear games, and I think that having games execute this in 3D is almost always preferred by the casual gamer. I think that this just comes down to these linear games being very story focused, which is often helped greatly when you bring in the environments and live instrumental music found in 3D games. Now before we get into this final style of game design, I want to preface this by mentioning one of my favorite games of all time, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This game completely changed the formula for 3D Zelda, going from a linear game to an open one. That being said, when the sequel to this game, Tears of the Kingdom, was announced, many fans were hoping for a return to form for the series. Instead, what people got was essentially Breath of the Wild completely expanded and embracing its open world design. In a recent interview, Zelda producer Eiji Aonuma was asked about these fans craving a linear Zelda game again, and he said, "It's interesting when I hear people say I miss traditional linear Zelda, because I'm wondering, why do you want to go back to a type of game where you're more limited or more restricted in the types of things or ways you can play?" Naturally, we could feel a little shocked by this seemingly ignorant comment, but maybe we can think about it from his perspective. If you spent the last decade of your life working on improving open world game design and your recent games have sold record-breaking numbers, wouldn't you be a little confused when people ask to go back to the way things were before? Aonuma touches on this again when he says, "I do understand that desire we have for nostalgia, and so I can also understand it from that aspect. We as people have a tendency to want the thing we don't currently have." Now at first, once again, this seems like an ignorant statement, dismissing linear games as a thing of the past. And you know what? Maybe he truly does feel like this. In that case, I understand why he would feel this way. Anyone who's ever dedicated a lot of time to a project knows that there will be many doubts along the way. The thing is, if you let these doubts get to you, your progress will be slowed down. In the world of the gaming industry, producers like Aonuma cannot afford to slow down, and therefore it's a beneficial mindset to sort of brainwash himself into thinking his way is 100% right. With this all said, I absolutely disagree with this idea that linear gaming is something that should be left in the past. The great thing about linearity that often goes untold is that it actually lets you tell a cohesive story. One of my favorite games of all time is a modern title, Persona 5 Royal, and that game is about as linear as you can get, literally going day by day through the story. So let's take a look at open world 3D games. Do they really have some amazing factor that other games just can't replicate? Well, kind of. The level of exploration that this style allows for is amazing, and that is undeniable. Games like Elden Ring and Red Dead Redemption 2 would not be the same if it were all closed off in design with a bunch of loading screens. It's not a foolproof system though, and we can see clearly from games like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet that it can potentially make your game worse in some aspects. I actually think that these games are pretty good in terms of the ideas behind them, but the execution was just bad sometimes. The thing with open world games nobody seems to want to talk about is the fact that they take a ridiculous amount of work. Games like GTA 5 and Red Dead 2 don't come around by cutting corners. You can look up stories about how these games were like to develop, and you can find cases of people literally programming the most minute details into the game. So if you have Pokemon trying to expand too fast into the open world space and they end up cutting corners with optimization, you just end up with a sloppy experience. Admittedly, this is quite rare to see from big companies, and despite its faults, Scarlet and Violet have sold exceptionally well. It's just not great to see as a fan of gaming with, sloppy being rewarded like this. I want to go back to the whole linear Zelda conversation though, because this whole debate is really put into perspective with this. When Aonuma makes it seem as if people don't know what they want, he's kinda right. What was the #1 complaint about the game preceding Breath of the Wild, Skyward Sword? It's too linear. So of course Aonuma would be a little dismissive considering that this switch to open world completely changed the landscape of Zelda and its success. Open world is what let the series appeal to both its fans and completely new players others as well. But ultimately, I think that this is a unique situation. The reason why it works so well with Zelda is because that this series was perfect for a change like this. Zelda was always about exploring new areas and environments, something that open world gives you the most freedom with. However, if we took a franchise rooted much deeper in story elements and put it in an open world, I think it would actually hurt it a lot. Obviously, it's not impossible since GTA was able to pull off a kind of hybrid of open world gameplay with a linear story, but on average most games can't do that. You know what though, this is all subjective and I can't speak for everyone with this video. All I know is that I like both open and linear style of games, as long as it's implemented properly. If the design of a game matches the gameplay and the atmosphere, I think that it makes for a perfect combination.